So this is one of the more difficult problems in this particular section of the Udemy course. It's replace a substring, and basically we're going to ask the user to input a pattern, input a string, then input a pattern to find within that string, and then replace that pattern with a variable 2. So for example, we've got this complicated string looking for the pattern AA and replacing each instance of AA with X, so giving us this result. Now, how are we going to code that? Well, first of all, we're going to need a string input, a string pattern, and a string 2, and we're going to get the user to input all three. Finally, we're going to call the function replace string, helpfully included in the question, and output whatever that result is. So, replace string. The signature is given in the question, but it's basically a return type string which takes in a string input, a string pattern, and a string 2. Basically all three variables that the user has input. We know that we're going to need a string result, but we're not sure what we're going to return yet. We only know we're going to return result, but we don't know what it's going to be. So essentially we're going to the first thing I usually do is get a size variable for the thing we're going to iterate through. Int size equals input.size, and we're going to go and iterate through the entirety of our string input and concatenate to our string result depending on what we find. It's size, not size. Basically, if I'm going to use this as an example, just in the comments, the instructor included double A, B, C, A, B, triple A, D. The pattern is AA, and the 2 pattern is X. Basically, we're going to look at each character or each element in our string and compare it to the first element in the pattern. And if the element in the string doesn't match the first character in our pattern, then we know we're not going to really need to convert this to anything. So for example, in the case of this B, B does not equal A, so we know we're not going to need to replace any part of this B sequence with X, because it's not matching the pattern at all. C is the same, and D is the same as well. So in the event that we find the first character of the pattern and input I don't match, we're just going to concatenate whatever that input I is into our result. So that's so far so good. However, what if we do have a match? For example, in this we have a full pattern match, and in this we have a partial pattern match, and in this we have firstly a full pattern match, then it's replaced by the X, and then we have a partial pattern match following that. So how are we going to code this? Well, if input I does equal the pattern 0, then we're going to make use of another function called startsWith, and we're going to call startsWith using input, pattern, and I. That is the position or index in the input string that we find a match. So for example, in the first case we've got index 0 or I equals 0. We're going to call this function, and if the pattern fully matches or is fully incorporated within our string for the entirety of the pattern, we know that our result, we're going to concatenate the to pattern, in this case x, to our result. And there's one other thing which I'm going to mention in a moment. Otherwise, if this starts with function returns false, then we know that the entire pattern doesn't match, and therefore we're just going to concatenate, in this case a normally, not replace a with x, or because we don't have an AA. We're going to simply concatenate that into our result, and eventually we'll be able to go through the entirety of the input string returning a result. However, we need our starts with function to actually work. So how are we going to code that? We've got our string input, unput, string pattern, and int position. And basically the first thing we're going to check is that we can actually go through the entirety of the pattern. If pattern size plus pos is greater than input size, then we know we've got a problem here. We're going to return false. Then we're going to go through the entirety of our pattern. We're only, in this case, we're only looking at this AA. We're going through that, iterate through that. Longer patterns are possible, and if input I plus pos, that's this, the pos is the I from this loop here, if that does not equal pattern I, then we know to return false. However, if we go through the entirety of the pattern, like for example with AA and AA, and we have no false, basically if they're completely equal, if A equals A, and then we increment both I plus pos and I is 1, 1 plus 0 is 1, pattern I is 1, index 1, index 1, they're equal. If we go through the entirety of the pattern and they're the same, we can return true. Then we go back to our if statement here, add this pattern 2 to the result rather than our A, our input I, and then we want to jump from AA. We don't want to go through this second A here. We want to kind of ignore that it ever existed. To jump to the next part in the pattern, the easiest way is to do this: I plus or equals int pattern dot size minus 1. Now the minus 1 is there because we're already incrementing in our loop. We're adding 1 to our I variable each time. So rather than jumping just one space, we want to jump for the space of the size of the pattern. In this case it's 2. But we don't want to increment the next one after that. Otherwise, well, we will be ignoring the B and shortening whatever our result is by one potentially vital character, and we'll get an incorrect return. Let's see if this pattern is coded as expected. So we're going to use this AAB, CAB, AAD, AA, and X, and we've got basically exactly the result that we were expecting. We'll, for completeness sake, try one more. which is basically the same input: A, B, C, A, B, A, D, A, and quadruple A. And there we are, a very long string. I hope that helps.